The autumn wind of 1867 carried more than sagebrush across the Wyoming Territory. It carried the desperate whisper of a wounded woman collapsing into Jacob Thorne's firelight, bleeding from a gunshot and clutching secrets that men would kill for. When the widowed cowboy pulled that bullet from her side and saw the fierce intelligence burning in her eyes despite the pain, he discovered something that 3 years of drifting hadn't been able to give him. But would saving Catalina Reyes finally teach him how to save himself? A dead man's laughter echoed through the abandoned mining camp as Jacob Thorne stuffed his few belongings into weathered saddlebags. The sound wasn't real, just wind whistling through broken timber and rusted metal, but it made his skin crawl all the same. 3 years of living alone in places like this had taught him to hear things that weren't there. The Wyoming Territory in the fall of 1867 was a harsh mistress, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Yellow grass stretched endlessly toward purple mountains, and the air carried the sharp bite of coming winter. Jacob's camp sat in what used to be Silver Creek Mine, back when men still believed they could dig fortune from stone. Now only ghosts remained, along with one stubborn cowboy who couldn't seem to find a reason to move on. His horse, Mercy, stood patient as always while he worked. She was getting old, gray creeping around her muzzle like frost on a window. Sometimes Jacob wondered if she stayed with him out of loyalty or just because she was too tired to run away. Most days he felt the same. The silver wedding band on his finger caught the dying sunlight. 3 years since Mary died. 3 years since he'd spoken her name aloud. The consumption had taken her slowly, and their unborn child with her. Some men turned to drink after losing everything. Jacob had turned to emptiness instead, drifting from place to place like a tumbleweed with no particular destination in mind. He'd been a different man once. During the war, soldiers had looked to him for answers. He'd been good at reading terrain, good at keeping men alive in impossible situations. But that was before grief hollowed him out, before he learned that all the survival skills in the world couldn't protect the people you loved most. A sound made him freeze, the distant crack of gunfire bouncing off canyon walls. Then another, and another. Jacob's hand moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, muscle memory taking over. In this country, gunshots usually meant trouble, and trouble had a way of finding lonely men whether they wanted it or not. The shots were coming from the north, maybe 2 miles away. Close enough to be dangerous, far enough to ignore if a man was smart. Jacob had survived 3 years by being smart, by avoiding other people's problems. But something about the rhythm of the shots bothered him. They weren't random. Someone was being hunted. Mercy snorted and pawed the ground, sensing his tension. Animals always knew when violence was coming before humans figured it out. Jacob pulled his rifle from its scabbard and checked the chamber. 6 bullets, same as always. He'd learned to count ammunition the way other men counted money. The gunshots stopped suddenly, leaving only the wind and the hammer of his own heartbeat. Jacob waited, listening for sounds that would tell him which way danger was moving. In the war, silence after gunfire usually meant someone was dead. The question was whether the right person had won. Minutes passed like hours. Then he heard it, the thunder of approaching hooves, coming fast and hard. Multiple horses riding like their lives depended on speed. Jacob grabbed his saddlebags and moved toward Mercy, ready to mount up and disappear into the maze of abandoned mine shafts and rocky outcroppings that surrounded the camp. But the sound changed direction, veering away from his position. Relief flickered through him, followed immediately by something else. Disappointment? When had he started hoping for excitement to break up the endless sameness of his days? The hoofbeats faded into the distance, heading south toward the main trail. Whatever drama had played out in the darkness, it was moving away from him now. Jacob should have felt grateful. Instead, he felt cheated, as if the universe had offered him a chance at something and then snatched it away at the last second. He was loading his rifle back into its case when the second sound reached him, different from the first, quieter but somehow more urgent. A single horse moving much slower than the others. The rider was either injured or trying very hard not to be noticed. Jacob found himself walking toward the sound before he'd consciously decided to move. Years of isolation had made him careful, but they'd also made him curious about any break in routine. The horse was coming from the north, following the same path as the others but at a much slower pace. Through the gathering darkness, he could make out the shape of a rider hunched low in the saddle. Even from a distance, he could tell something was wrong. The horse was moving with the careful gait of an animal carrying a burden it wasn't sure it could bear. Jacob stepped back into the shadows, watching and waiting. The smart thing would be to stay hidden, let whoever it was pass by and continue south. But as the rider drew closer, he could see more details that made his chest tighten with unwanted concern. It was a woman, and she was barely staying upright. The woman's horse stumbled just as she reached the edge of Jacob's camp, and she nearly fell from the saddle. Only her death grip on the saddle horn kept her mounted. But Jacob could see she wouldn't last much longer. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and even in the poor light, he could see the way she favored her left side. "Easy there," Jacob called out softly, not wanting to spook either the horse or its rider. "You're hurt." The woman's head snapped up, and he saw her hand move toward something at her waist. A knife? Probably, or maybe a small pistol. Smart woman traveling alone in country like this. But the movement made her gasp in pain, and she swayed dangerously in the saddle. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jacob said, raising his hands to show they were empty. "Name's Jacob Thorne. This is my camp." For a moment, she just stared at him, weighing her options. Then her horse took another stumbling step, and the decision was made for her. She slid from the saddle more than dismounted, landing hard on her knees in the dirt. "Please," she whispered, and Jacob could hear the desperation in her voice. "They're still coming. The Brennan boys. They think I know something, but I don't. I swear I don't." Jacob had heard of the Brennan gang, outlaws who'd been terrorizing small towns and isolated homesteads throughout the territory. They were the kind of men who shot first and never bothered asking questions later. If they were after this woman, she was in more trouble than a simple bullet wound could explain. He moved closer, keeping his movements slow and obvious. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe in her early 20s. Her skin was the warm brown of someone who spent time in the sun, and her clothes, though torn and dusty, had once been well-made. This wasn't some random traveler. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who mattered to people. "Let me see," he said gently, kneeling beside her. She tried to pull away, but the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her, and she cried out softly. "My name is Catalina," she said through gritted teeth. "Catalina Reyes, and I'm sorry for bringing trouble to your camp." "Trouble has a way of finding me whether I invite it or not," Jacob replied, examining the wound as best he could in the firelight. The bullet had gouged a line along her ribs, deep enough to bleed freely but not deep enough to hit anything vital. She'd been lucky. A few inches to the right and she wouldn't have made it this far. "Why are they after you?" he asked, more to keep her talking than because he needed to know. People in shock sometimes stopped breathing if they got too quiet. "My father died last month," Catalina said, wincing as Jacob began cleaning the wound with water from his canteen. "Before he passed, he kept talking about something he'd hidden, something that would keep me safe. But he never told me what it was or where to find it." Jacob nodded, understanding more than she might expect. Dying men often made promises they couldn't keep, left instructions that made sense only to them. "And the Brennan boys think you know where this something is hidden? They think Papa told me before he died. They've been asking questions all over town, offering money for information about our family. When I couldn't tell them what they wanted to hear," she gestured weakly at her wounded side. As Jacob worked to bandage the injury with strips torn from his own shirt, he found himself studying her face. There was something about her eyes, a fierce intelligence that reminded him painfully of Mary. His wife had looked at the world the same way, as if she could see possibilities that other people missed. "You can't stay here," he said finally. "If they're tracking you, they'll find this place eventually." "I know." Catalina's voice was barely above a whisper. "I just needed to rest for a minute. My horse is spent, and I don't know how much farther I can ride." Jacob looked at her horse, a sturdy mare that was clearly well cared for despite the hard riding. The animal was exhausted but not injured. With some rest and water, she could probably carry her rider a few more miles. The question was where they could go that would be safe from men like the Brennans. "There's a place," he said slowly, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Devil's Canyon, about 5 miles east. It's a maze of rock formations and old mining tunnels. Easy to hide in, hard to track through." Catalina looked at him with something like hope in her eyes. "You know it well?" "Well enough." Jacob finished tying off the bandage and sat back on his heels. "But I should warn you, it's dangerous country. Easy to get lost, easy to fall and break your neck if you don't know where you're going." "Are you offering to show me the way?" she asked quietly. Jacob felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening after being locked for too long. 3 years of running from his own ghosts, 3 years of avoiding any connection that might lead to more loss. But looking at this brave, injured woman, he realized he was tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of pretending that survival was the same thing as living. "Yeah," he said, standing and offering her his hand. "I guess I am." The sound of distant hoofbeats drifted across the night air, still far away but definitely getting closer. The Brennan boys had found their trail. The rope snapped just as Jacob was pulling Catalina up onto Mercy's back, and the sound cracked through the night like a gunshot. For a heart-stopping moment, she dangled half on and half off the horse, her wounded side screaming in protest while Jacob grabbed desperately for her arm. "I've got you," he whispered fiercely, hauling her up behind him. But they both knew how close she'd come to falling, and how little time they had left before their pursuers arrived. The hoofbeats were getting louder now, maybe a mile away and closing fast. Jacob could hear voices too, rough men shouting orders to each other as they spread out to search the abandoned mining camp. These weren't random drifters looking for easy money. They moved like hunters who knew their prey was wounded and running scared. Mercy stepped carefully through the darkness, picking her way between scattered mining equipment and piles of broken rock. The old mare had carried double before, but never with one rider injured and both of them trying to stay quiet enough to avoid detection. Every step felt like it might be the one that gave them away. "How much farther?" Catalina breathed against his ear, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. "Half-mile to the canyon entrance," Jacob replied, guiding Mercy around a rusted or cart. "But the tricky part comes after that." Devil's Canyon had earned its name honestly. During his weeks of exploring the area, Jacob had discovered that the rock formations created a natural maze, dozens of narrow passages that twisted and turned like a snake's belly. Some led to dead ends, others to sheer drops that could kill a careless traveler. But for someone who knew the safe paths, it was the perfect place to disappear. Behind them, a shout went up from the mining camp. Someone had found Jacob's cold fire pit, along with the blood-stained cloth he'd used to clean Catalina's wound. The hunt was about to get much more serious. "There!" came a voice, closer than Jacob had expected. Fresh tracks heading east. Jacob urged Mercy into a faster walk, the best pace they could manage while staying quiet. Every instinct told him to run, to give the horse her head and race for the canyon as fast as they could go. But running would make noise, and noise would bring bullets flying in their direction. "Jacob," Catalina said quietly, "if they catch us, they won't." He cut her off, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "But if they do," she continued, "don't let them take me alive. Promise me that." The request hit him like a physical blow. In her voice, he heard the same desperate resolve that Mary had shown during her final days, the determination of someone who'd rather face death than surrender control of their fate to cruel men. "It won't come to that," Jacob said, but his hand drifted unconsciously to the gun at his hip. They reached the canyon entrance just as the moon broke free from a bank of clouds, flooding the landscape with silver light. The opening was little more than a crack between two massive stone walls, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. But it was also their only escape route, unless they wanted to make a stand against impossible odds. "Hold tight," Jacob warned, and guided Mercy into the narrow passage. The canyon walls rose up on either side like the ribs of some massive beast, blocking out the sky and muffling sound. Mercy's hooves echoed strangely in the confined space, creating phantom footsteps that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jacob had explored these passages many times, but never at night, never with someone else's life depending on his memory of the safe paths. "Left here," he murmured, more to himself than to Catalina, guiding Mercy into a passage that curved sharply away from the main canyon floor. The path climbed steadily upward, winding between house-sized boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls centuries ago. In the darkness, familiar landmarks became strange and threatening. More than once, Jacob had to stop and study the rock formations, making sure he was still on the right track. "Listen," Catalina whispered suddenly. Jacob pulled Mercy to a halt and strained his ears. At first, he heard only the wind whistling through the canyon and the distant howl of a coyote. Then it reached him, the sound of horses entering the canyon behind them, moving slowly and carefully through the narrow entrance. "How many?" he asked. "At least 3, maybe 4. Catalina had twisted around to look back the way they'd come, though the canyon walls blocked any direct view of their pursuers. Jacob made a quick calculation. 4 men against 1, with an injured woman to protect, in terrain that was dangerous even for someone who knew it well. The odds weren't good, but they weren't impossible either. The canyon had advantages as well as dangers, if he was smart enough to use them. "There's a place up ahead," he said, urging Mercy forward again. "Natural shelter where we can wait them out. These boys don't know the canyon like I do. If we're patient, they might just get themselves lost." But even as he spoke the words, Jacob knew it wouldn't be that simple. Men like the Brennan gang didn't give up easily, especially when they smelled profit. And something about Catalina's story bothered him. Why would hardened outlaws go to so much trouble for information about one dead Mexican miner? There had to be more to this than she was telling him. The passage opened suddenly into a small circular clearing surrounded by sheer stone walls. In the center stood a natural pillar of rock, worn smooth by wind and water over countless years. It was exactly the kind of place Jacob had been looking for, defensible with good sight lines and only one way in or out. "This is it," he said, helping Catalina down from the horse. But as soon as her feet touched the ground, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There were other tracks in the sand, boot prints and horse hooves, maybe a day old. Someone else had been here recently. Someone who knew about this hidden sanctuary in the heart of Devil's Canyon. The rifle barrel pressed against Jacob's neck was cold as winter steel, and the voice behind it carried the calm authority of someone who'd killed before. "Don't move, friend. Keep your hands where I can see them." Jacob's mind raced through possibilities while his body stayed perfectly still. The tracks in the sand should have warned him. Someone had been using this canyon hideout long before he discovered it. Now that someone had the drop on him, and Catalina was caught in the middle of whatever was about to happen. "Turn around slow," the voice commanded. "And keep those hands high." Jacob obeyed, turning to face a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a different time. Tall and lean, with silver hair and weathered brown skin. He wore the simple clothes of a working man but carried himself like someone accustomed to respect. Most surprising of all, his dark eyes held intelligence and caution rather than the cold cruelty Jacob expected from an outlaw. "You're not one of the Brennan boys," the man said, lowering his rifle slightly but keeping it ready. "No, I'm not." Jacob's voice stayed steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Name's Jacob Thorne. This is Catalina Reyes, and she's hurt." At the sound of her name, the stranger's entire demeanor changed. His eyes widened with recognition, and he lowered the rifle completely. "Catalina? Miguel's daughter. You knew my father?" Catalina stepped forward, ignoring Jacob's warning gesture. Her voice held a mixture of hope and suspicion that made Jacob's chest tighten, with protective instincts he'd thought were buried with his wife. "Knew him?" The man's weathered face broke into a sad smile. "Child, I taught him everything he knew about mining when he first came north from Sonora. I'm Carlos Reyes, your father's brother." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow. An uncle, alive and hiding in the same canyon where they'd sought refuge? The coincidence felt too convenient, too perfect. But Catalina's reaction told him it was real. She stumbled forward with a cry of joy that quickly turned to tears. Uncle Carlos? But Papa said you were dead. He said the Brennan gang killed you 3 years ago. Carlos embraced his niece carefully, mindful of her injury. Your father said what he needed to say to keep you safe. The Brennans did try to kill me, but I escaped into these canyons. I've been living here ever since, watching and waiting. Waiting for what? Jacob asked, his soldier's instincts still on high alert, despite the family reunion unfolding before him. Carlos's eyes met his over Catalina's head, and Jacob saw depths of pain and purpose that reminded him of his own reflection in quiet moments. Waiting for someone to finish what your father started, child. Waiting for the right person to trust with the truth. From somewhere deeper in the canyon came the sound of voices, harsh, angry men calling to each other as they searched the passages. The Brennan boys had found the entrance to the hidden clearing and were working their way closer. Time was running out for explanations. We need to move, Jacob said urgently. Is there another way out of here? Carlos nodded toward what looked like a solid wall of rock. There's a passage behind that boulder. It leads to the old mine workings, but the path is treacherous. One wrong step and you'll fall into a shaft that goes down 300 feet. Better than staying here to get shot, Jacob replied, but his mind was already working on a different problem. 3 people, 1 horse, and a maze of dangerous tunnels in complete darkness. Even if they escaped the Brennan gang, they might not survive the journey. Uncle Carlos, Catalina said suddenly. What did Papa start? What truth are you talking about? The old man's eyes darted between her and Jacob, weighing decisions that clearly carried life or death consequences. Your father wasn't just a minor child. He was part of something much bigger, a network of people helping others escape from places where they weren't safe. The Underground Railroad, some called it, though it never used actual trains. Jacob felt the pieces click into place with sickening clarity. The Underground Railroad had been active throughout the war, helping escaped slaves reach freedom in the North. But it hadn't ended with the war's conclusion. There were still people who needed help, still routes that required protection. The Brennan boys aren't just after random treasure, he said slowly. They're after information. Names, routes, safe houses. Exactly. Carlos's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. And they think Catalina knows where her father hid the records. The truth is, Miguel never told her anything because he was trying to protect her. But men like the Brennans don't understand the difference between protecting someone and abandoning them. The voices in the canyon were getting closer now, accompanied by the scrape of boots on stone and the occasional curse as someone stumbled in the darkness. Jacob could pick out at least 3 distinct voices, maybe 4. They were moving methodically, checking every passage and crevice. The records, Catalina said suddenly. Are they real? Did Papa actually hide something? Carlos's smile was sad but proud. Your father kept detailed maps of every safe route from Texas to Canada. Names of conductors, locations of safe houses, everything needed to keep the network running. He hid them where only family would think to look. Where? Jacob and Catalina asked simultaneously. But before Carlos could answer, the sound of boots on stone grew much louder. Someone had found the entrance to their hiding place. In the moonlight filtering down from above, Jacob could see the shadow of a man with a rifle, moving carefully but steadily toward their position. Time's up, Jacob whispered, drawing his gun. Carlos, get Catalina to that passage. I'll hold them off as long as I can. No. Catalina's voice was firm despite her injury. I won't let you die for me. And I won't let you die for your father's secrets, Jacob replied. Sometimes the best way to honor someone's sacrifice is to accept help when it's offered. The shadow at the entrance moved closer, and Jacob could hear the careful breathing of someone trying very hard not to make noise. In a few seconds, the shooting would start, and in the confined space of the canyon clearing, ricochet bullets would be almost as dangerous as aimed ones. There's another way, Carlos said suddenly. The mine entrance, it's not just an escape route. It's where Miguel hid the records. If we can reach them, we can destroy the information before the Brennans get their hands on it. Jacob looked at the old man with new respect. Carlos wasn't just offering them an escape. He was offering them a chance to complete Miguel's mission, to protect the people whose lives depended on those secret routes remaining secret. How far? Jacob asked. Half-mile through the tunnels. But like I said, it's dangerous. The mine shafts go deep, and some of the support timbers are rotten. We'll be risking our lives just to get there. Better than sitting here waiting to get shot, Catalina said with a courage that made Jacob's heart skip. Let's go. The shadow at the entrance suddenly resolved into the shape of a man with a rifle, scanning the clearing with predatory focus. Jacob held his breath, hoping the darkness would hide them for just a few more seconds. Then the man's eyes locked onto theirs, and his mouth opened to shout a warning to his companions. Jacob's gun was in his hand and firing before his conscious mind had time to process the decision. The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, and Jacob's bullet took the Brennan man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the stone. But the damage was done. His cry of pain and surprise had alerted his companions, and Jacob could already hear boots running toward their position. Move! Carlos shouted, grabbing Catalina's hand and pulling her toward the hidden passage. Jacob followed, pausing only to grab his saddlebags and give Mercy a slap on the rump that sent her galloping toward the canyon's main entrance. The horse was smart enough to find her own way out, and her hoofbeats might confuse their pursuers about which direction the humans had gone. The passage behind the boulder was even narrower than Jacob had expected, barely wide enough for one person at a time, with rough stone walls that scraped against their shoulders as they squeezed through. Carlos led the way with the confidence of someone who'd traveled this route many times, but Jacob could feel Catalina struggling behind him, her injured side making every movement painful. Keep going, he urged her quietly. We're almost through. The passage opened into a vast underground chamber that took Jacob's breath away. Moonlight filtered down through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating a space that looked like a cathedral carved from living rock. Mining equipment sat scattered around the floor. Pickaxes, shovels, or carts, and coils of rope that spoke of years of hard labor in the mountain's depths. But it was what sat in the center of the chamber that made Jacob stop and stare. A small cabin, built from carefully fitted stones and weathered timber, stood like an island in the middle of the underground lake. Smoke was rising from its chimney, and warm light glowed behind shuttered windows. Papa built this? Catalina whispered in amazement. We built it together, Carlos replied, his voice thick with memory. Your father believed that even people doing dangerous work deserved a safe place to rest. This was our sanctuary, our planning room, our last refuge if everything else went wrong. Jacob heard voices echoing from the passage they'd just left. The Brennan boys had found the entrance and were working up the courage to follow them into the darkness. But the narrow passage would slow them down, force them to come single file where they'd be easy targets. How many ways into this chamber? He asked Carlos. Just the one we used and one more that leads deeper into the mine. But that second passage is mostly collapsed, hasn't been safe to use in years. Good. That means we can defend this place if we have to. Jacob checked his gun, counting bullets by feel. He'd fired one shot at the entrance, leaving him with 5. Not much against 4 or more attackers, but the confined space and limited approaches might even the odds. Catalina was staring at the cabin with an expression Jacob couldn't quite read. The records are in there? Everything your father spent 15 years collecting, Carlos confirmed. Maps, names, routes, safe houses. Enough information to keep the network running for decades, or to destroy it completely if it falls into the wrong hands. Then we destroy it, Catalina said without hesitation. Papa died trying to keep that information safe. I won't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Jacob looked at her with growing admiration. 3 hours ago, she'd been a wounded stranger who'd stumbled into his camp seeking help. Now she was making decisions that would affect the lives of hundreds of people she'd never met. The transformation was remarkable, but it also worried him. People who tried to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders often collapsed under the burden. There might be another way, Carlos said carefully. The network still needs those routes. There are still people who need help escaping from places where they're not safe. If we could find someone trustworthy to take over your father's work. Someone like who? Catalina asked. Carlos's eyes moved to Jacob, and suddenly the cowboy understood what the old man was suggesting. The network needed someone with the skills to keep people safe, someone who could read terrain and plan routes, someone who wasn't afraid to fight when fighting was necessary. No, Jacob said firmly. I'm not the right person for that kind of responsibility. Why not? Catalina's voice was gentle but challenging. You've kept us alive so far. You know this country better than most people, and you understand what it means to lose someone you care about. The sound of voices from the passage was getting closer, and Jacob could see the flicker of torchlight reflecting off the stone walls. They were running out of time for philosophical discussions. We can argue about the future later, he said. Right now, we need to deal with the present. Carlos nodded toward the cabin. The records are in a strongbox under the floorboards. If we're going to destroy them, we should do it now before those men get close enough to stop us. But as they moved toward the cabin, Jacob noticed something that made his blood run cold. The smoke rising from the chimney wasn't the thin, steady stream of a banked fire. It was thick and black, the kind of smoke that came from burning paper and leather. Someone's already inside, he said grimly, and they're destroying the records right now. The cabin door opened, and a figure stepped into the moonlight. A woman with graying hair and the kind of steady gaze that belonged to someone accustomed to making hard decisions. She held a rifle with the ease of long practice, but it wasn't pointed at them. Carlos, she said calmly, you're just in time to help me finish what Miguel started. Rosa. Carlos's voice was filled with shock. But how did you? The same way you've been getting messages to the safe houses, she replied. Miguel wasn't the only one who knew about this place. He asked me to come here if anything happened to him, to make sure the records were either passed on safely or destroyed completely. Jacob's mind raced to process this new development. Another player in the game, another person with their own agenda and motivations. But friend or enemy, and how many more people knew about the underground chamber and its secrets? From the passage came the sound of men arguing about who should go first into the darkness. The Brennan boys were close now, maybe 5 minutes away from discovering the chamber. Whatever decisions needed to be made, they had to be made quickly. The records, Catalina said urgently. Are they destroyed? Rosa's smile was sad but determined. Most of them, but there's one set of documents I couldn't bring myself to burn. Maps of the northern routes, the ones that go through Wyoming and Montana toward Canada. They're still being used, Catalina. People are still depending on them. Then we take them and go, Jacob said. All of us right now. Where? Carlos asked. These men won't stop hunting us. And without the records, the network will collapse within a year. Jacob looked around the chamber, at the faces of people who'd dedicated their lives to helping others, at the woman who'd risked everything to protect her father's legacy. 3 years ago, he'd been a different man. A man who took responsibility for others, who made hard decisions and lived with the consequences. Maybe it was time to become that man again. The records don't have to be destroyed, he said slowly. And the network doesn't have to collapse. But it needs someone who can protect it. Someone who understands what's at stake. Someone like you? Rosa asked, studying his face in the moonlight. Jacob looked at Catalina, seeing in her eyes the same fierce determination that had driven her father to risk everything for strangers. Someone like us, he corrected. If we're going to do this, we do it together. The sound of boots on stone echoed through the chamber as the first of the Brennan boys emerged from the passage, torch in one hand and gun in the other. The real fight was about to begin. The torch fell from the Brennan man's hand and shattered on the stone floor, sending sparks flying in every direction as Jacob's bullet found its mark. But the flickering flames revealed something that made Jacob's heart sink. 3 more shadows moving through the narrow passage, and the glint of gun barrels catching the light. Get down! He shouted, diving behind an overturned cart as bullets began whistling through the underground chamber. The Brennan boys had learned from their first mistake. Instead of charging blindly into the open space, they were using the passage entrance as cover, firing calculated shots that forced Jacob and his companions to stay hidden while they worked out a plan to advance. There's 4 of us and 4 of them, Rosa called out from behind a pile of mining equipment. But they control the only way out. Not the only way, Carlos replied, his voice coming from somewhere near the cabin. Remember what I said about the collapsed passage? It's not completely blocked. A determined person might be able to squeeze through. Jacob peered around the edge of the Urquhart, trying to get a better look at their attackers. The leader was a big man with a scarred face who moved with the confidence of someone who'd been in plenty of gunfights. The other three spread out behind him, professional enough to avoid clustering together where one well-placed shot could take out multiple targets. Catalina Reyes, the leader shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. My name is Zeke Brennan. I think you've got something that belongs to me. I don't have anything of yours, Catalina called back, but Jacob could hear the strain in her voice. The running and hiding were taking their toll on her injury. Your daddy stole from me before he died, Brennan continued. Information that's worth a lot of money to the right people. Now, I can do this the easy way or the hard way. Easy way, you come out peaceful and we have ourselves a little conversation. Hard way. He paused to fire a shot that ricocheted off the cabin wall. Well, let's just say the hard way involves a lot more blood. Jacob caught Catalina's eye across the chamber and saw his own thoughts reflected there. Brennan wasn't interested in negotiation. He was trying to position his men for a better attack. While he kept them talking, his companions were moving to flank their defensive positions. What kind of information? Jacob called out, hoping to buy them a few more seconds. The kind that keeps certain people safe, Brennan replied with a laugh that had no humor in it. Your Mexican friend's daddy was part of a network that's been costing my employers a lot of money. Slaves escaping north, criminals avoiding justice, troublemakers disappearing before they can be dealt with proper. That network depends on routes and safe houses, and those routes are written down somewhere in this mountain. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground air. Brennan's employers, bounty hunters, slave catchers, men who made their living hunting other human beings. The network Miguel had died protecting wasn't just helping escaped slaves anymore. It was helping anyone who needed to disappear from people who meant them harm. The war's been over for 2 years, Rosa called out. Slavery's illegal now. Legal and illegal ain't the same as profitable and unprofitable, Brennan replied. There's still good money in returning property to its rightful owners, if you know what I mean. And there's even better money in making sure certain routes stay closed permanent. A movement in Jacob's peripheral vision caught his attention. One of Brennan's men had worked his way around to the far side of the chamber, using the mining equipment as cover. In another minute, he'd have a clear shot at the cabin where the records were hidden. Jacob made a quick decision. He couldn't protect everyone from a stationary position, but he might be able to create enough chaos to give the others a chance to escape. His hand moved to the extra ammunition in his belt, 12 bullets total, including what was left in his gun. Not much for a sustained fight, but enough to make an impression if he used them wisely. Carlos, he whispered. How long to get through that collapsed passage? 10 minutes for someone who knows the way. Longer for someone who doesn't. And the records? Still in the cabin. Rosa saved the most important ones. Jacob looked at Catalina, memorizing her face in the flickering light. 3 years of running from responsibility. 3 years of avoiding connections that might lead to loss. But some things were worth the risk. When I start shooting, you three head for that passage. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Jacob, no, Catalina said, but he was already moving. He rolled out from behind the Urquhart, firing as he came up in a crouch. His first shot took the flanking man in the leg, sending him sprawling behind a pile of broken timber. His second and third shots forced the other Brennan boys to duck for cover, giving his companions the opening they needed. Go! He shouted, but when he glanced toward the cabin, he saw that Catalina hadn't moved. She was staring at something near the burning fireplace, her face pale with shock. The records, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. Rosa, you said you saved the most important ones? The northern routes, yes. They're in the strong box under the... They're not there. Catalina's voice was flat, emotionless. The strong box is empty. Jacob felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. All of this, the chase, the fighting, the desperate escape through the canyon, had been for nothing. Someone had already taken the records they'd been trying to protect. Miguel, Rosa whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. He moved them before he died. He never trusted anyone completely, not even family. A bullet whined past Jacob's ear, reminding him that their immediate problem wasn't the missing records, but the very present danger of the Brennan gang. But Brennan himself had stopped shooting, and Jacob could hear him laughing. Well, Brennan called out. Sounds like you folks are having the same problem I am. Looking for something that ain't where it's supposed to be. You don't have the records either, Jacob realized. Not yet, but I know where they are, thanks to a little conversation I had with Miguel before he passed. See, dying men tell all sorts of interesting stories when they're properly motivated. Jacob saw Catalina's face crumple with grief and rage. The thought of her father being tortured for information was almost more than she could bear. But there was something else in her expression. A flicker of understanding that made Jacob's pulse quicken with hope. You're lying, she said, her voice gaining strength. Papa would never tell you anything, no matter what you did to him. Maybe not directly, Brennan admitted, but he kept muttering about the place where it all began and going home to Sonora. Took me a while to figure out what he meant, but I think I know now. Jacob watched Catalina's face carefully, looking for any sign that Brennan's words meant something to her. But her expression remained carefully blank, giving nothing away. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Course you don't, Brennan replied. But you will. See, I figure a man's daughter knows his secrets better than anyone. And I got all the time in the world to help you remember. The sound of boots on stone told Jacob that Brennan's men were moving again, working their way closer to the cabin. They'd figured out that their quarry couldn't escape through the main passage, which meant they could take their time and be methodical about cornering them. The collapsed passage, Jacob whispered urgently to Carlos. How close is it to the cabin? 20 feet, maybe 30, but it's exposed ground, no cover. Jacob checked his remaining ammunition. 8 bullets left, for enemies, and 30 feet of open ground to cross. The math wasn't in their favor, but sometimes the impossible was the only option left. When I make my move, he told the others, you run for that passage and don't look back. Whatever happens to me, you get those records to people who can use them. What records? Catalina asked bitterly. We don't even know where they are. Jacob looked at her carefully, seeing past the grief and anger to the intelligence beneath. I think you know more than you're letting on, he said quietly. And I think your father chose his hiding place very carefully. Before she could respond, Jacob was moving again, sprinting across the open ground toward the cabin while firing at anything that looked like it might be a target. Behind him, he could hear his companions running for the collapsed passage, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. A bullet tugged at his sleeve, another one kicked up sparks near his feet. But somehow he made it to the cabin wall, pressing himself against the stone foundation while he caught his breath and planned his next move. Inside the cabin, he could hear the fire still crackling in the fireplace, consuming the last of Rosa's burned documents. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were fighting desperately to protect records that might not even exist anymore. But as he looked through the cabin window, Jacob saw something that made him reconsider everything. There, carved into the wooden mantelpiece above the fireplace, were words in Spanish that he couldn't read but somehow understood. El hogar está donde el corazón recuerda. Home is where the heart remembers. The carved words above the fireplace seemed to glow in the flickering light, and Jacob suddenly understood why Catalina had looked so stricken when she saw the empty strongbox. Her father hadn't hidden the records in some random location. He'd hidden them somewhere that would mean something to his daughter, somewhere that would require her heart as much as her mind to find. Catalina, he called out, hoping she could hear him over the sound of gunfire. The mantelpiece. What does it say? From somewhere near the collapsed passage came her voice, strained but clear. Home is where the heart remembers. It's something Papa used to say when I was little. Jacob ducked as another bullet shattered the cabin window above his head. The Brennan boys were getting bolder, moving closer to the cabin now that they thought they had their quarry trapped. But Jacob's mind was racing, putting together pieces of a puzzle that Miguel Reyes had designed to be solved only by someone who truly knew him. "Where did you live when you were little?" he shouted back. "Sonora, Mexico. A little town called Santa Maria." "But Jacob, that's hundreds of miles from here." "Not the town," Jacob replied, understanding flooding through him. "Something closer. Something your father built to remind him of home." The silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the sound of the Brennan boys moving through the chamber. Then Catalina's voice came back, filled with sudden hope. "The shrine," she whispered, and even at a distance Jacob could hear the emotion in her words. "Papa built a little shrine to the Virgin of Guadalupe on the hill above our camp. He said it reminded him of the one in Santa Maria where he proposed to Mama." Jacob felt a surge of admiration for the dead miner's cleverness. Miguel had hidden the records in the one place his daughter would think to look if she truly needed them, a place that spoke to faith and memory rather than greed or desperation. "How far?" Jacob called out. 2 miles north of here, up the canyon wall. There's a path, but it's steep and dangerous in the dark." Jacob checked his ammunition again. 6 bullets left, and at least 3 enemies still moving through the chamber. The odds were getting worse by the minute, but now they had something more valuable than weapons. They had hope. "Rosa, Carlos," he called out. "Can you get her to that shrine?" "If we can reach the collapsed passage," Carlos replied. "It connects to an old mining tunnel that leads to the surface." "But Jacob, what about you?" Before Jacob could answer, Zeke Brennan's voice cut through the darkness. "Enough talking. Boys, burn them out." The smell of kerosene filled the air as one of Brennan's men poured fuel around the base of the cabin. Jacob realized with growing horror that they intended to smoke him out by setting the building on fire. In the confined space of the underground chamber, the smoke would be as deadly as bullets. A torch flew through the broken window, and within seconds the cabin floor was ablaze. Jacob grabbed the strongbox from under the floorboards, empty as Catalina had said, but maybe useful as a shield, and prepared to make a run for the passage. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. There, carved into the wooden floor beneath where the strongbox had been, were more words in Spanish. And these weren't just a sentimental message, they were directions. 20 pasos norte, 10 pasos este, donde las flores crecen. 20 steps north, 10 steps east, where the flowers grow. Jacob smiled grimly. Miguel had been even more careful than they'd thought. The shrine wasn't just a hiding place. It was a landmark, a starting point for finding the real treasure. The records were buried somewhere near the shrine, marked by flowers that Miguel had planted as a sign for his daughter. The fire was spreading quickly now, and smoke was beginning to fill the chamber. Jacob could hear the Brennan boys coughing and cursing as the air grew thick and choking. But the fire was also giving him cover, hiding his movements as he crept toward the collapsed passage. "Jacob!" Catalina's voice was desperate now. "Where are you?" "Coming," he replied, but his words were lost in a fit of coughing as smoke burned his lungs. He stumbled through the darkness, using the strongbox as a shield against the random shots that the Brennan boys were firing blindly through the smoke. The collapsed passage loomed ahead of him like a mouth in the stone, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Carlos was waiting at the entrance, his weathered face grim with determination. "Rosa and Catalina are already through," he said. "But Jacob, there's something you need to know. The passage doesn't just lead to the surface, it leads to a choice." "What kind of choice?" "The tunnel splits about halfway up. One branch leads to the shrine where the records are hidden. The other leads to the main canyon, where your horse is waiting." Jacob understood immediately. He could escape with his life, or he could help recover the records that hundreds of people depended on for their safety. But he couldn't do both, not with the Brennan boys close behind and time running out. "There's a third option," Carlos continued. "The main tunnel has old mining charges placed along the walls. If someone knew where to place a bullet, they could bring down enough rock to seal the passage permanently. The Brennan boys would be trapped in the chamber until the smoke cleared, giving the rest of us time to escape. And whoever fired that shot? Carlos's silence was answer enough. From behind them came the sound of men shouting orders, trying to organize a pursuit through the smoke-filled chamber. The Brennan boys were tough and determined, but they weren't giving up just because their quarry had found a way out. Go, Jacob told Carlos. Catch up with the others. Make sure they find those records. Jacob, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Jacob's voice was calm, filled with the peace that comes from finally understanding your purpose. 3 years ago, I failed to protect someone I loved. I won't make that mistake again. Carlos clasped his shoulder briefly, then squeezed through the narrow opening and disappeared into the tunnel beyond. Jacob waited, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing closer, until he was sure the old man had enough of a head start. Then he turned back toward the burning chamber, toward the men who'd made the mistake of threatening people he cared about. 6 bullets left, and he intended to make everyone count. But as he moved back into the smoke and chaos, Jacob heard something that made him pause. From somewhere in the darkness came a woman's voice, calling his name with desperate urgency. Catalina had come back for him. The choice he'd thought was simple had just become infinitely more complicated. Save himself, save the network, or save the woman who'd given him a reason to believe in second chances. The smoke was getting thicker, the fire was spreading, and the Brennan boys were getting closer. Whatever decision he made, he had to make it now. Through the smoke and flames, Jacob could see Catalina's silhouette at the passage entrance, refusing to leave without him despite the danger. In that moment, he realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were simply the inevitable result of becoming the person you were meant to be. He started running toward her, toward the passage, toward a future that was uncertain but no longer empty. Behind him, the fire roared higher, and ahead lay whatever came next. But for the first time in 3 years, Jacob Thorne was running toward something instead of away from it. Jacob's lungs burned worse than the flames behind him as he dove through the narrow passage opening, Catalina's hands pulling him into the tunnel just as a bullet sparked off the stone where his head had been. The explosion that followed wasn't from his gun. It was the sound of burning timber collapsing in the chamber below, trapping the Brennan boys in a prison of smoke and falling rock. "You came back," he gasped, still not quite believing she'd risked her life for him. "You didn't think I'd leave without my stubborn cowboy, did you?" Catalina replied, but her smile quickly faded as she saw the blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. "You're hit." Jacob looked down at his arm, surprised to see the dark stains spreading across the fabric. In the chaos of the escape, he hadn't even felt the bullet graze him. "Just a scratch. We need to keep moving." The tunnel stretched ahead of them like the throat of some massive beast, carved from solid rock by men who died decades before Jacob was born. Carlos and Rosa were waiting 50 yards ahead, their faces grim in the pale light filtering down from cracks in the ceiling. "The charges didn't go off," Carlos said as they approached. "The tunnel's still open behind us, which means the Brennan boys will be following as soon as they find a way through the smoke," Rosa added. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they're breathing down our necks again." Jacob nodded, his mind already working on the problem. The tunnel split ahead, just as Carlos had described. One branch led to the shrine where Miguel's records were hidden. The other led to the main canyon and freedom. But there wasn't time to reach both destinations before their pursuers caught up. "We split up," he decided. "Carlos and Rosa take the canyon path, get to safety. Catalina and I go for the shrine." "That's not smart," Rosa protested. "For people have a better chance than two. For people also make more noise and leave clearer tracks," Jacob replied. "Besides, if something happens to us, you two can still get word to the network about what we've learned." Catalina studied his face in the dim light, reading the determination there. "You think the records are really at the shrine? Your father was a careful man. He wouldn't have left directions carved in his cabin floor unless he was sure you'd be able to follow them." Jacob checked his gun. 4 bullets left. Not much, but hopefully enough. "The question is whether we can find them before Brennan figures out where we're going." From behind them came the distant sound of voices echoing through the tunnel. The Brennan boys had found their way through the collapsed passage and were starting their pursuit. Time was running out faster than Jacob had hoped. "Go," he told Carlos and Rosa. "If we're not at the canyon entrance by dawn, assume we didn't make it." The two older members of their group disappeared into the darkness of the left-hand tunnel, their footsteps fading quickly in the enclosed space. Jacob and Catalina took the right-hand path, climbing steadily upward through passages that grew narrower and more treacherous with each step. "Tell me about the shrine," Jacob said as they walked, partly to keep Catalina talking and partly because he needed to understand what they were looking for. "Papa built it 3 years ago, right before he got sick," she replied, her voice echoing strangely in the tunnel. "Just a small stone altar with a statue of the Virgin Mary that he carved himself. He used to go there every evening to pray, especially after Mama died. And the flowers? Wildflowers. Papa planted them in a pattern around the base of the shrine. He said they reminded him of the garden Mama kept in Sonora." Catalina paused, her breathing labored from the climb and her injury. "Jacob, what if we're wrong? What if the records aren't there? Then we'll figure out another way to keep the network safe," Jacob replied with more confidence than he felt. "Your father didn't protect those routes for 15 years just to let them die with him." The tunnel began to level out, and Jacob could see a faint glow ahead that looked like starlight. They were approaching the surface, but the climb had taken longer than he'd expected. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers were getting closer, close enough that Jacob could make out individual words. "This way," came Brennan's voice, harsh and determined. "The tunnel splits up ahead." Jacob grabbed Catalina's hand and pulled her forward, no longer worried about making noise. Speed was more important than stealth now. They burst out of the tunnel onto a narrow ledge overlooking the main canyon, the night air cold and sharp after the stifling atmosphere underground. "There," Catalina whispered, pointing to a rocky outcropping about 100 yards above them. "That's where Papa built the shrine." Jacob could see it now, a small structure silhouetted against the stars, barely visible in the darkness. The path leading to it was little more than a goat track carved into the canyon wall, dangerous enough in daylight and potentially deadly in the darkness. "Can you make the climb?" he asked, studying Catalina's pale face. "I'll make it," she replied with the same fierce determination that had brought her this far. They started up the treacherous path, using handholds carved into the rock by Miguel's own hands. Every step was a calculated risk, every move a dance with gravity and death. But Jacob found himself thinking not about the danger but about the man who'd built this path. A father so devoted to protecting his daughter that he'd hidden his life's work in a place that required both courage and faith to reach. Halfway up the cliff face, Catalina stumbled. Jacob caught her before she could fall, but the movement sent loose rocks tumbling down into the canyon below. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the night silence. "You hurt?" he asked quietly. "Just tired. And scared." She looked up at him with eyes that held more trust than he felt he deserved. "Jacob, if something happens to me..." "Nothing's going to happen to you," he cut her off. "We're going to find those records, and we're going to make sure your father's work continues. That's a promise." From below came the sound of boots on stone as their pursuers emerged from the tunnel. Jacob could see torchlight dancing on the canyon walls, at least 3 men, maybe 4. The Brennan gang had survived the collapse and was still hunting them. "Up there!" came a shout from below. "I can see them on the cliff." A gunshot echoed through the canyon, and a bullet whined off the rock near Jacob's head. The range was too great for accurate shooting, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. The Brennan boys were already starting up the path behind them. "Move," Jacob urged, and they resumed their climb with desperate urgency. The shrine appeared before them like something from a dream, a simple stone altar topped with a beautifully carved statue of the Virgin Mary, surrounded by wildflowers that seemed to glow in the starlight. Even in the darkness, Jacob could see the love and skill that had gone into its construction. 20 steps north, 10 steps east, where the flowers grow, Catalina whispered, reciting her father's directions from memory. They counted off the steps together, ending up at a patch of earth where purple lupins grew in a perfect circle. Jacob dropped to his knees and began digging with his bare hands, praying they guessed correctly. His fingers hit something hard buried just beneath the surface. A wooden box, carefully wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from moisture. Inside, Jacob could feel the crackle of papers and the weight of what felt like a journal. "We found them," Catalina breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Papa's records. They're really here." But their celebration was cut short by the sound of boots on the path below. The Brennan boys had reached the base of the cliff and were starting their climb. In the torchlight, Jacob could see Zeke Brennan's scarred face twisted with determination and rage. "End of the line, folks," Brennan called out. "Nowhere left to run now." Jacob looked around desperately for another escape route, but the shrine sat on a narrow ledge with sheer drops on 3 sides. They were trapped, with enemies climbing toward them and nowhere to go but down. "The records," he said urgently to Catalina. "Can you get them to safety?" "How?" "There's no way off this ledge except past them." Jacob checked his gun one more time. 4 bullets against at least 3 men. But maybe, if he was smart about it, 4 bullets would be enough. Not to win, but to buy time for something else. "There is one way," he said quietly, looking out over the canyon to where the eastern sky was just beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. "But you're not going to like it." The rope Jacob had spotted dangling from an old mining pulley 50 feet below the shrine was their only hope, but reaching it would require a leap of faith that could easily end in death. Catalina stared at the gap between the ledge and the rope, her face pale in the pre-dawn light. "It's too far," she whispered. "And even if we make it, that rope could be rotten. It might not hold our weight." "It'll hold," Jacob said with more confidence than he felt. The rope was old, maybe left behind by miners decades ago, but it looked solid enough in the dim light. "Your father wouldn't have built his shrine where he couldn't see all the ways in and out. He knew about that rope." Behind them, the sound of climbing boots was getting closer. Brennan and his men were maybe 5 minutes from reaching the ledge, and once they arrived, the conversation would be conducted with bullets instead of words. "I can't," Catalina said, backing away from the edge. "Jacob, I'm not brave enough for this." "You rode through the night with a bullet wound to warn me about danger," Jacob replied gently. "You came back into a burning building to save my life. You climbed a cliff face in the dark to honor your father's memory. If that's not brave, I don't know what is." He wrapped the precious records in his coat and tied the bundle securely to his belt. Whatever happened next, Miguel's life work wouldn't be lost. The network of safe routes and trusted contacts would survive, even if they didn't. "Together," he said, taking Catalina's hand. "On the count of 3. "Jacob, wait." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I need you to know something. These past few hours, running with you, fighting beside you, it's made me remember what it feels like to hope for tomorrow." "Me too," he admitted, surprised by the truth of it. 3 years of wandering aimlessly, 3 years of believing his life was over, and this wounded stranger had somehow brought him back to the world of the living. 1, he counted. From the path below came Brennan's voice, closer now. "Almost there, boys. Get ready to finish this." 2. Catalina squeezed his hand, her grip strong despite her injury. In her eyes, Jacob saw trust and determination and something else that made his heart skip. The same look Mary used to give him when she believed he could do the impossible. 3. They jumped together, sailing out over the canyon in a moment that felt like flying. For a heartbeat, Jacob thought they'd miscalculated, that they'd fall short of the rope and tumble into the darkness below. Then his reaching hand closed around the rough hemp, and the rope swung them in a wide arc across the canyon face. The landing was harder than he'd expected. They hit the opposite wall with enough force to knock the breath from both of them, but the rope held. Jacob wrapped his legs around the line and helped Catalina get a secure grip before looking back toward the shrine. Brennan and 2 of his men had reached the ledge and were staring across the gap with expressions of rage and disbelief. The outlaw leader raised his gun, but the range was too great for accurate shooting with a handgun. "This ain't over," Brennan shouted across the canyon. "I know who you are now, Jacob Thorne. I know where you come from. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Brennan knew his real name, knew his history, then the danger wasn't over. Men like that had long memories and longer grudges. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, he needed to get Catalina to safety and figure out what to do with the records that hung against his hip like a weight of responsibility. They rappelled down the rope to a narrow ledge, then worked their way along the canyon wall to a series of handholds that led to the bottom. By the time they reached the canyon floor, the sun was rising over the eastern mountains, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red. "Where now?" Catalina asked, exhaustion clear in her voice. "First, we find Carlos and Rosa," Jacob replied. "Then we figure out how to use what your father left us." They walked through the morning light toward the canyon entrance, where Mercy waited patiently beside a small stream. The old mare nickered softly when she saw Jacob, as if to ask what had taken him so long. "Good girl," he murmured, checking her over for injuries. She was tired but unharmed, ready for whatever came next. As they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon behind, Jacob pulled out the wrapped bundle of records and handed them to Catalina. "These belong to you now. Your father's legacy, your choice what to do with them." She unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a leather journal filled with detailed maps and careful notes, along with sheets of paper covered in names and addresses. It was 15 years of dangerous, patient work, compressed into a package small enough to carry in a saddlebag. "I can't do this alone," she said quietly. "I don't know enough about the network, about the routes, about keeping people safe." "You won't be alone," Jacob replied. "Your Uncle Carlos knows the southern routes. Rosa understands how to get messages to the safe houses. And I—" He paused, considering words he'd never thought he'd say again. "I know how to protect people who are traveling through dangerous country." Catalina looked up at him with something like wonder in her eyes. "You're really going to stay? Help me continue Papa's work. If you'll have me." Jacob's voice was rough with emotion he'd kept buried for 3 years. "I spent too long running from responsibility, from connection, from the chance to make a difference. Your father died protecting something bigger than himself. Maybe it's time I tried to do the same." She reached out and took his hand, and Jacob felt something settle into place in his chest. A sense of purpose he'd thought was lost forever. The network needed protection, and these people needed someone who understood both the dangers of the trail and the value of the lives they were trying to save. "There's something else," Catalina said, opening the journal to a page near the front. "Look at this." Jacob read over her shoulder, his Spanish limited but sufficient to understand the basic meaning. It was a letter from Miguel to his daughter, written in the careful hand of a man who knew he might not live to deliver it in person. "My beloved Catalina," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and you have found the courage to follow the path I could not teach you while I lived. The work is dangerous, but it is also holy. Every person we help to safety is a victory against those who would make the world smaller and meaner. I have tried to give you everything you need: routes, contacts, safe houses. But the most important thing I can give you is the knowledge that you are strong enough to carry this burden. You have your mother's heart and your father's stubborn determination. Trust in both. The network will try to test you, to see if you are worthy of their secrets. Some will accept you because you are my daughter. Others will need to see your courage for themselves. But I know you will prove worthy, because you have already proven it by finding this letter. Be careful. Be smart. Be brave. And remember that the work we do is never finished. It only changes hands from one generation to the next. Your loving father, Miguel Reyes." Catalina wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading. "He believed I could do this, even when I didn't believe it myself." "Smart man," Jacob said quietly. "He saw what I see. Someone who's brave enough to risk everything for strangers, strong enough to carry her father's legacy, and stubborn enough to never give up." They mounted Mercy together, the records safely secured in Jacob's saddlebags along with the tools and supplies they'd need for the journey ahead. The network stretched from Texas to Canada, a web of secret routes and hidden sanctuaries that helped people escape from lives of bondage and fear. It was dangerous work, the kind that made enemies of powerful men and put a price on your head. But it was also necessary work, the kind that reminded you why freedom mattered and what it meant to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. As they rode out of Devil's Canyon into the Wyoming morning, Jacob realized that somewhere in the space between pulling a bullet from Catalina's side and jumping across a canyon at dawn, he'd found what he'd been searching for during 3 years of aimless wandering. He'd found a reason to stay. The widowed cowboy who'd spent 3 years running from his ghosts had finally stopped running. And the wounded woman who'd stumbled into his firelight had given him something more valuable than gold. She'd given him back his purpose, his connection to the world, and his belief that second chances were possible for anyone brave enough to reach for them. Behind them, Devil's Canyon kept its secrets. And ahead lay the work of carrying on Miguel Reyes's legacy, one rescued life at a time. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more men like the Brennans, more narrow escapes, more impossible choices. But they would face those challenges together, and that made all the difference. Sometimes the most important thing you can pull out of someone isn't a bullet. It's the belief that they're worth saving. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, saving someone else teaches you how to save yourself.